I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who would rehearse a sentence just to survive saying it. But there I was, standing in the middle of a luxury hotel lounge, repeating the same words in my head like a quiet prayer I didn't believe would work. The room smelled expensive. Not perfume exactly. Something warmer. Leather, polished wood, the faint bitterness of coffee that had already cooled in porcelain cups no one rushed to drink. The kind of place where people sat like they belonged. Like they knew the rules without ever being taught. I didn't. My hands were folded in front of me, fingers laced too tightly. I could feel my pulse in my wrists, in my throat, even in my ears. Each beat sounded louder than the low hum of conversations drifting around the room. I told myself to breathe. I told myself I could still leave. But my feet didn't move. Across the lounge, he sat alone. Not isolated in a lonely way. Isolated the way mountains are isolated. Still. Unbothered. Untouched by the noise around them. He wore a dark suit, simple in a way that made everything else feel like effort. No exaggerated gestures. No phone glued to his hand. Just one arm resting along the chair, the other loosely holding a glass he hadn't touched in minutes. He looked like someone used to being watched. And yet, he wasn't watching anyone. That somehow made it worse. I'd been standing there for longer than I wanted to admit. Long enough to feel ridiculous. Long enough for my confidence to thin out and start tearing at the edges. This wasn't who I was supposed to be. I wasn't impulsive. I wasn't reckless. I didn't ask strangers for favors that could humiliate me in ways I wouldn't recover from. I built my life on quiet confidence. On self-awareness. On knowing when to walk away. But that was before the invitation. Before the message that sat unread on my phone for hours, because I already knew what it meant. My ex's birthday was coming. And somehow, against all logic, against all the progress I told myself I'd made, the thought of walking into that room alone felt unbearable. Not because I missed him. Because I remembered exactly how small I used to feel in his world. I shifted my weight, suddenly aware of how I was standing. Too stiff. Too careful. Like my body was trying not to take up space it didn't deserve. I forced my shoulders back, the way I'd been taught to do when I wanted to look confident. It didn't help. The room still felt too big. Too polished. Too full of people who would glance at me and immediately know I was visiting, not belonging. I looked at him again. Up close, the calm around him felt deliberate. Chosen. The kind of calm you earn by surviving things without letting them show on your face. His posture wasn't defensive. It was settled. Like nothing in this room had the authority to rush him. I wondered how many people had tried. My mouth went dry. This was the part where a sensible person would stop. Where pride would intervene. Where dignity would tap me on the shoulder and say enough. Instead, I took one step forward. The sound of my heel against the floor felt louder than it should have. Sharp. Accusatory. I half expected someone to turn and look at me, to ask what I thought I was doing. No one did. I was close enough now to notice the small things. The faint crease at the corner of his eyes when he blinked. The way his jaw tightened, not from tension, but from restraint. The watch on his wrist, understated, probably worth more than my rent. I hated that I noticed. I hated that part of me was already measuring myself against him and losing. My chest tightened. Not with fear exactly. With the weight of what I was about to risk. I wasn't asking him to pretend to like me. I was asking him to step into a moment meant to remind me of my place. I inhaled slowly, counting in my head the way I did when panic crept too close. My palms were damp now. I wiped them discreetly against the side of my dress and immediately felt foolish for caring. He looked up. Not startled. Not annoyed. Just attentive. That was almost worse. For a brief second, I considered lying. Saying something casual. Asking for directions. Commenting on the weather. Anything that would let me retreat without fully exposing myself. But the truth had already climbed too high in my chest to be swallowed again. I stood there, aware of how close I was, aware of the line I was crossing, aware that whatever happened next would change the trajectory of the next few days of my life. Maybe more. He waited. Didn't rush me. Didn't fill the silence. Just watched, like he understood that some moments needed room to unfold on their own. My voice surprised me when it finally came out. Steadier than I felt. quieter than I intended. "I know this is strange," I said. Even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were inadequate. Too small for the ask they were carrying. I swallowed, forcing myself to continue before courage evaporated completely. "There's something I need to ask you. And I need you to hear it before you decide anything." His expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened, subtle and unmistakable, like a door opening inward. I didn't know how he'd react. I didn't know if he'd laugh, or dismiss me, or look at me the way people do when they decide you've overestimated your worth. I only knew one thing with absolute certainty. I couldn't walk into that birthday alone. If stories about quiet strength, emotional turning points, and unexpected connections speak to you, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Ari Love Beyond, like this video, and stay with me. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, quiet and polite, dressed up as courtesy. No emojis. No warmth. Just a clean message with a date, a venue, and a sentence that pretended to mean nothing more than it said. "Hope you can make it." I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Long enough for my reflection to blur across the glass. Long enough to feel that old, familiar tightening just beneath my ribs. It wasn't the birthday itself. It was everything the birthday represented. For a moment, I tried to convince myself it didn't matter. That I could ignore it. That I had outgrown the need to prove anything to anyone, especially to someone who had already decided I wasn't enough. But my body reacted before my logic could catch up. My shoulders tensed. My jaw clenched. My breath shortened, just slightly, the way it always did when I was about to be reminded of a version of myself I'd worked hard to bury. I hadn't seen him in months. The breakup had been calm. Civil, almost gentle, if you didn't listen too closely to the words beneath the words. We were sitting across from each other at a small cafe, the kind that tried too hard to feel intimate. Soft lighting. Neutral colors. A place designed for difficult conversations that people wanted to pretend were mature. He didn't touch his coffee. Neither did I. "I just think the timing isn't right," he said, hands folded carefully on the table, as if he were explaining a delay in shipping, not the end of something I had invested myself in. Timing. That word floated between us, weightless and impossible to argue with. I nodded, because nodding felt easier than asking questions I already knew the answers to. "It's not about you," he added quickly. "You know that. Fit. Compatibility. Expectations." They arrived one after another, neatly arranged, like items on a list he'd rehearsed in advance. When he mentioned his family, his voice softened. Not apologetically. More like he was relieved to finally name the real authority in the room. "They just have a certain vision," he said. "It's complicated." I remember noticing how calm he looked. How settled. Like this decision had already been made somewhere far above both of us, and he was simply delivering the outcome. I didn't cry. That was the part everyone praised later. How composed I was. How strong. What they didn't see was how small I felt walking home afterward. How the city seemed louder, sharper, less forgiving. How every passing couple felt like a quiet reminder of something I hadn't been chosen to keep. I told myself I was fine. I told myself I didn't want to be part of a world that needed convincing to accept me. And for a while, I believed it. Until the invitation. The venue alone said everything the message didn't. An upscale private club. The kind of place with a waiting list and a dress code enforced by smiles that didn't reach the eyes. A place where last names mattered. Where being invited meant you already belonged. I knew the guest list without seeing it. Friends who spoke in measured tones. Family members who assessed people the way investors assess risk. Women who fit seamlessly into photographs, into expectations, into futures that had been planned long before introductions were made. I imagined walking in alone. The polite surprise. The questions disguised as concern. "Are you seeing anyone now? How have you been? You look well." All of it layered with a quiet evaluation that never needed to be spoken out loud. I wouldn't be there to celebrate him. I would be there to be seen. Or worse, to be confirmed as temporary. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, replaying moments I hadn't thought about in months. Small things that hadn't felt significant at the time. The way his mother had once smiled at me, tight and brief, before turning her attention elsewhere. The way conversation shifted when I entered a room, not abruptly, but subtly, like a current changing direction. No one had ever been openly unkind. They didn't need to be. Exclusion doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it shows up as politeness that never quite opens into warmth. As doors that are technically unlocked, but never fully open. In the days after the invitation, I caught myself shrinking in ways I thought I'd outgrown. Rethinking outfits I hadn't planned to wear. Rehearsing responses to questions no one had asked yet. I hated myself for it. I hated that a single event could pull me back into a version of myself that measured worth by proximity. I tried to distract myself. Took on extra work. Said yes to plans I didn't care about. Anything to keep my mind from circling back to that date on the calendar. But the closer it got, the louder the question became. Would I go? And if I did, who would I be when I walked through those doors? Going alone felt like surrender. Not going felt like erasure. The worst part wasn't missing him. It was the idea of standing in that room as proof that I had been a phase. A deviation. A story they told themselves before returning to what made sense. One evening, scrolling mindlessly, I paused on a photo someone had posted from a previous gathering at the same venue. Everyone looked effortless. Paired. Aligned. I imagined myself there, glass in hand, smiling politely while my chest tightened with every interaction. That's when I realized how deeply this had gotten under my skin. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about dignity. I wanted to walk into that room and not feel like an explanation. I wanted to exist without apology, without context, without having to justify why I had been there at all. And yet, the truth pressed in from every angle. I didn't have someone to bring. Not someone who could stand beside me and hold the space steady. Not someone who could meet their glances without flinching. Not someone who could make my presence feel intentional instead of incidental. The irony didn't escape me. I had always believed I was enough on my own. But there are rooms that don't care about belief. There are rooms that measure worth differently. The night before I went to the hotel lounge, I stood in front of my mirror longer than usual. Not adjusting my appearance, just looking. Taking inventory of the lines on my face, the set of my shoulders, the way my eyes looked when I wasn't trying to perform resilience. I wasn't broken, but I was tired. Tired of being graceful in situations that never asked me what I needed. Tired of pretending rejection hadn't left fingerprints all over my confidence. By the time I left my apartment the next afternoon, I knew one thing with unsettling clarity. Walking into that birthday alone would reopen wounds I had barely managed to close. And I wasn't willing to bleed quietly for the sake of anyone else's comfort. That's when the idea surfaced. Not fully formed. Not logical. Just a fragile thought that felt dangerous enough to be worth considering. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need spectacle. I needed presence. Someone beside me. Someone who could stand in that room and make my existence undeniable. As the hotel doors slid open and the low hum of the lounge wrapped around me, the weight of the decision settled fully into my chest. That's when I realized I needed someone beside me. By the time I finally crossed the distance between us, the decision no longer felt dramatic. It felt inevitable. That was the most unsettling part. I wasn't shaking anymore. My hands had steadied. My breath had slowed into something controlled, almost practiced, like my body had accepted that retreat was no longer an option. I stopped just short of his table, close enough to be acknowledged, far enough to leave him an exit if he wanted one. He looked up again, fully this time. Up close, the calm I'd noticed earlier wasn't softness. It was discipline. The kind that comes from knowing you don't have to rush, because nothing important escapes you. I could feel my heart begin to race again, reacting to the stillness he carried so easily. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said. My voice sounded different than it had in my head. Lower. More even. Like someone else had stepped in to speak for me. He didn't answer immediately. He studied me, not openly, not rudely. Just enough to register details. Posture. Intention. The way my weight leaned slightly forward, as if I'd already committed to the fall. "Yes," he said finally. One word. Neutral. Uninviting and not unkind. I gestured vaguely to the empty chair across from him, unsure if I was allowed to ask. "May I?" I said. Another pause. Then a small nod. I sat. The chair was more comfortable than I expected. Plush, supportive, the kind of furniture designed to make people stay longer than they intended. I noticed it because my body needed something to anchor itself to. Up close, I noticed how little he moved. Even breathing, he seemed measured. His presence filled the space without effort, without display. "I won't take much of your time," I said quickly, words tumbling closer together now that they'd started. I could hear myself slipping toward apology. I forced myself to slow down. He said nothing. So I continued. "There's an event coming up," I said. "A birthday." I hated how small it sounded. He tilted his head slightly, a gesture that invited continuation without encouraging it. "It belongs to someone I used to be with," I added. Still nothing. I searched his face for impatience, for irritation, for anything that would let me gracefully abort this conversation before it stripped me bare. There was nothing. So I told him. Not everything. Not yet. I told him about the invitation. About the room it would be held in. About the kind of people who would be there. I chose my words carefully, trimming away emotion where I could, presenting the facts like a case I hoped would make sense. As I spoke, I became acutely aware of how ridiculous this must sound. A stranger unloading a social dilemma onto another stranger in a luxury hotel lounge. At any point, he could have stopped me. He didn't. I felt exposed by that alone. "I don't want to go alone," I said finally, the truth pressing through all the careful framing. "And I don't want to not go." There it was. The contradiction laid bare. For the first time, his expression shifted, just slightly. Not sympathy. Something closer to recognition. "You're asking me to accompany you," he said. He didn't phrase it as a question. "Yes," I replied. The word felt heavier than I expected. "I know how this sounds," I said, a nervous laugh threatening to break through. "And I wouldn't ask if I had another option that didn't feel worse." He leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other with unhurried precision. "Why me?" he asked. The question landed cleanly, without accusation. I hadn't prepared an answer for that part. "Because the truth was uncomfortable. Because you look like someone they wouldn't ignore," I said carefully. "And because you don't look like someone who needs their approval." His eyes remained on mine, unblinking. "I don't know you," he said. "I know," I replied. "And that's part of why this works." Silence stretched between us, long enough for me to become acutely aware of every sound in the room. The clink of glass. The low murmur of voices. The soft shuffle of shoes across polished floors. I could feel the gaze of the lounge moving around us, not focused, but present. I wondered what we looked like from the outside. A woman leaning forward, speaking too earnestly. A man listening like time belonged to him. "I'm not asking you to pretend to be something you're not," I added quickly. "Just to be there." He studied me again, this time more openly. His gaze didn't linger where it shouldn't. It didn't roam. It assessed. "And what do I get out of this?" he asked. There it was. The question I'd been dreading. I reached into my bag before I could overthink it, pulling out a small envelope I'd prepared and sliding it across the table toward him. "I can pay you," I said. It's not what you're used to, I'm sure. But it's everything I can afford." The envelope felt thin against the table. Embarrassingly so. I waited for the inevitable dismissal. For the polite refusal. For the subtle humiliation of being reminded how small my offering was. He didn't touch it. Instead, he pushed it back toward me with 2 fingers, the movement slow and deliberate. "I don't need your money," he said. The words landed with more weight than if he'd accepted it. I felt a strange mix of relief and fear coil in my chest. "Then why are you still listening?" I asked before I could stop myself. His lips curved slightly. Not a smile. Something closer to amusement, tempered by restraint. "Because you're not asking for what you think you're asking for," he said. I frowned. "I don't understand." "You're not asking me to attend a birthday," he continued. "You're asking me to step into a history I know nothing about. A hierarchy I didn't create." I swallowed. "Yes," I said quietly. He leaned forward then, closing the distance just enough to shift the balance of the conversation. "Tell me," he said, voice low, "what happens if you walk in alone?" The question cracked something open. Images flashed through my mind uninvited. Polite smiles that never reached eyes. Conversations that slid past me instead of including me. The subtle recalibration of worth based on who stood beside whom. They'll be kind, I said. That's the worst part. He waited. I'll become a footnote, I continued. Proof that everything worked out exactly the way it was supposed to. He nodded once, slowly. And if I go with you? He asked. They'll see me, I said. Even if only through you. The admission tasted bitter and honest. For a long moment, he said nothing. He picked up his glass, took a measured sip, then set it down again, as if even thirst was something he refused to rush. You're aware, he said carefully, that this will invite scrutiny. Yes. Judgment. Yes. And consequences you may not anticipate. Yes, I said again, the words steady despite the tightening in my chest. He watched me closely now, as if weighing something that went far beyond the request itself. Why now? He asked. Why not let the past remain where it is? Because the past was knocking. Because ignoring it had started to feel like agreeing with it. Because I'm tired of being graceful about my own erasure, I said. The words surprised me as they left my mouth. Not because they weren't true, but because I hadn't realized I was ready to say them out loud. Something shifted in his expression then. Not softness. Not pity. Respect. He leaned back again, exhaling slowly. You're very composed for someone asking a stranger to step into chaos, he said. I'm not composed, I replied. I'm just practiced. That earned me the faintest curve of his mouth. Another pause. Longer this time. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down, the way decisions do when they begin to matter more than the reasons that led to them. Finally, he spoke. I won't be anyone's prop, he said. I wouldn't ask you to be, I replied immediately. And I won't lie, he continued. I don't need you to, I said. Just don't contradict me. That seemed to amuse him. And boundaries, he asked. Clear, I said. Non-negotiable. He nodded. Time frame. One evening, I replied. Nothing beyond that unless we both decide otherwise. That was the first moment I allowed myself to think beyond the night itself. The possibility hung there, undefined and dangerous. He studied me one last time, as if committing something to memory. Then he said it. I don't need your money, he repeated. But I need the truth. We didn't seal the agreement with a handshake. There was no dramatic pause, no decisive gesture that marked the moment as important. It happened quietly, the way decisions that change things often do. With a nod. With mutual understanding that whatever this was, it would exist within lines we had yet to fully draw. The truth, I said, repeating his condition, more to study myself than to confirm it. What does that mean to you? He considered the question carefully, eyes drifting briefly toward the window, where the city pressed up against the glass in a mosaic of lights and motion. It means I won't play a version of you that doesn't exist, he said. And I won't be cast as someone I'm not. I nodded. That felt fair. No public affection, he continued. No stories that require explanation later. Relief loosened something in my chest. I hadn't wanted spectacle. I hadn't wanted performance. I just wanted presence. We arrived together, I said. We stay for a reasonable amount of time. If either of us wants to leave, we leave. No questions. He inclined his head. Boundaries, he said. Good. And I added, choosing my words carefully, whatever happens in that room stays there. His gaze returned to mine, sharper now. You don't want this to follow you, he said. I don't want it to define me, I replied. That earned another small nod. The rules, once spoken, settled between us like a fragile truce. Clear enough to stand on. Thin enough to remind us they could crack under pressure. He stood first, signaling the conversation's end without dismissing it. Send me the details, he said. Time. Place. Dress expectations. Thank you, I said before I could stop myself. He paused, then looked at me again. Don't thank me yet, he said. You haven't seen the cost. The days that followed felt strangely suspended, as if time had slowed to accommodate the weight of anticipation. We didn't text often. When we did, it was efficient. Logistics. Clarifications. No emojis. No unnecessary warmth. Just facts. Yet, even in that restraint, something subtle took shape. We met once more before the birthday, not to rehearse lines, but to align realities. It was his suggestion. A conversation, he said. So we don't trip over silence. We chose a quiet cafe this time. Neutral ground. Somewhere anonymity softened the edges of expectation. He arrived on time. Of course he did. We sat across from each other, coffee untouched between us, the familiarity of the setting echoing something uncomfortable in me. Too similar to the cafe where my relationship had ended. Too similar to a table where words had once dismantled a future. I wondered if he noticed the shift in my posture. If he could tell the memory had resurfaced. He didn't comment. Instead, he asked, "What do they know about you?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "What version of you exists in that room?" he clarified. "Before me." I thought about it. "They know my job," I said. "Where I grew up. That I wasn't what they expected." He waited. "They know I didn't come from money," I added. "And they never let me forget it." He nodded once, absorbing the information without reaction. "And what don't they know?" he asked. I hesitated. "That I stayed longer than I should have," I said quietly, trying to earn comfort instead of demanding respect. Something flickered across his face then. Not sympathy. Understanding. "They won't need to know anything new," he said. "We won't give them material." The simplicity of it steadied me. We talked through the evening in pieces. Not rehearsing dialogue, but mapping presence. Where to stand. How to move through a room designed to assess people by proximity. "Stay beside me," he said at one point. Not behind. Not ahead. The instruction felt strangely intimate. "I can do that," I said. He looked at me then, really looked, as if gauging whether I believed my own words. "Good," he replied. As the days passed, I noticed something unsettling. I felt calmer. Not relieved. Not excited. Calm. The kind of calm that comes from knowing you won't be alone in a room that once swallowed you whole. It scared me more than panic ever had. Because calm implied trust. And trust implied vulnerability. The night before the birthday, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, replaying fragments of conversation, imagining the room, the faces, the inevitable moment when eyes would turn toward us. I wondered what he would see when he looked at me then. Not the version of me trying to be impressive. The version bracing for impact. We met outside the venue the following evening. The building glowed against the night, all glass and confidence. Valets moved with practiced ease. Guests arrived in clusters, laughter spilling into the street like something rehearsed. He stepped out of his car first, smooth and unhurried, adjusting his jacket with a familiarity that suggested rooms like this bent easily around him. When he saw me, his gaze lingered for just a second longer than necessary. "You look steady," he said. "I don't feel it," I replied. "That's normal," he said. "Steadiness often arrives late." We walked toward the entrance together. The doors opened, and the air changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't hostile. It was evaluative. I felt it immediately. The subtle recalibration as people noticed us. The micropauses in conversation. The glances that slid quickly away, then returned with sharper focus. I felt my spine straighten instinctively. He noticed. His hand hovered near my back, not touching, just present enough to register as intention. The room opened around us. Music hummed low. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose and fell like controlled waves. And then I saw him. My ex stood near the center of the room, engaged in conversation, posture relaxed in a way I remembered too well. He looked happy. At ease. Like someone whose life had settled into alignment. For a moment, the old ache stirred. Then he looked up. His smile faltered. Just slightly. His gaze flicked to me. Then to the man beside me. And something shifted. I didn't miss it this time. Neither did the people around us. Introductions followed. Names exchanged. Titles whispered with interest that hadn't existed moments earlier. I watched, detached and alert, as the room rearranged itself around new information. The way questions softened. The way curiosity replaced courtesy. And through it all, he stayed beside me. Unmoved. Unperformative. At one point, during a lull in conversation, he leaned in slightly. "You're holding yourself differently," he murmured. "I am?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Like someone who doesn't need permission." The words landed deeper than I expected. We moved through the evening without incident, without spectacle, just presence. And yet, beneath the calm, tension threaded through every interaction. A quiet electricity that reminded me this wasn't over, that something was building. During a brief moment alone near the terrace, I exhaled shakily. I didn't realize how much I'd been bracing, I admitted. He watched the room beyond the glass, expression thoughtful. Rooms like this teach people how to brace, he said. And who they're allowed to relax around. I turned to him. And you? I asked. Do you belong here? He met my gaze. I belong wherever I choose to stand, he said simply. The clarity of it took my breath away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass, distant and indifferent. If this story is pulling you in, I thought, in that quiet space between words and understanding, take a moment to like the video. It helps Ari love beyond reach people who need stories like this. The thought felt oddly grounding. Then the sound of applause rose behind us, signaling another shift in the evening. He straightened. Stay close, he said. I nodded. And then the day came. This was the moment the room decided whether it would let me. The birthday wasn't announced with music or spectacle. It revealed itself gradually, like a private truth made visible only to those who already belonged. A soft shift in lighting. The appearance of staff carrying trays that weren't offered to everyone. A subtle tightening of the social circle around the center of the room. This was the real gathering. The rest had only been warm-up. The venue itself was unapologetic. High ceilings that made voices echo just enough to sound important. Walls dressed in muted tones, designed to frame people rather than compete with them. Everything here whispered permanence. Wealth that didn't need to announce itself, because it assumed recognition. As we moved deeper into the space, I felt the familiar sensation return. Not fear. Awareness. The awareness of being measured. Eyes lingered longer now. Conversations paused just slightly when we passed. Smiles appeared faster, stretched wider, adjusted in real time to accommodate new information. I had been in rooms like this before. I knew the choreography. What was different was how little I needed to perform. He walked beside me with the same calm he'd carried in the hotel lounge days earlier. No stiffness. No attempt to impress. He didn't scan the room for reactions. He didn't seek acknowledgement. Acknowledgement came anyway. It always does when power is present. The first shift happened quietly. Someone addressed him by title. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Just a respectful acknowledgement slipped into conversation as if it were obvious, as if everyone should have known already. I felt it ripple outward. Questions changed tone. Introductions became more careful. Names were repeated, mentally filed, recalibrated. I watched it happen in real time, the way a room reorganizes itself around perceived gravity. And for the first time, I wasn't the one being repositioned. He was laughing, glass in hand, posture open. He looked relaxed in the way people do when they believe the world is aligned with their expectations. Then his gaze found me. The shift in his expression was immediate. Confusion first. Then recognition. Then something else. Something less comfortable. He looked past me. At him. And, just like that, the balance changed. I saw it in the tightening of his jaw. In the way his shoulders squared, as if bracing for a conversation he hadn't prepared for. He took a sip from his glass, then another, movements just a fraction too quick. When he approached us, he didn't smile right away. Hey, he said, voice warm but cautious. I didn't know you were coming. I was invited, I replied evenly. It wasn't a jab. Just a fact. His gaze flicked again, briefly, toward the man beside me. And you are? He asked. Introductions were made. I watched the moment land. I watched understanding bloom, followed closely by discomfort. He recovered quickly. He always did. That had been one of his strengths. Well, he said, smile returning, I'm glad you could make it. The words were polite. The subtext wasn't. As he turned away to greet someone else, I noticed how the room responded. How his ease didn't return as fully as before. How his laughter sounded a little too loud now. A little too intentional. People who hadn't noticed me earlier noticed me now. Compliments appeared where indifference had lived. Questions softened. Invitations to join conversations surfaced organically, as if I'd always been part of the inner circle. It was dizzying. And quietly devastating. Because nothing about me had changed. Only my proximity. I felt it then. The old humiliation resurfacing, not as pain, but as clarity. This was what I had endured. This was what I had been navigating without words, without validation, without protection. He noticed. Could feel it in the way his attention sharpened, the way his gaze tracked interactions I had learned to ignore for survival. He saw the way people leaned in closer now. The way they laughed more readily. The way their questions assumed relevance instead of curiosity. He saw how easily worth was reassigned. At one point, an older woman I recognized from years earlier approached us. Her smile was practiced, her tone warm in a way it hadn't been before. "It's so lovely to see you," she said to me. "You look wonderful." I thanked her. She turned to him, her expression shifting again, deferential now. "We've heard so much about you," she said. He inclined his head politely. I stood there, watching the exchange like an observer in my own memory. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The room did the work for him. And in doing so, it exposed itself. The shock wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices. No confrontations. The shock was structural. It was watching a hierarchy reveal its rules out loud. It was seeing how easily dignity could be borrowed. How quickly respect could be reassigned. And how quietly I had been asked to accept less. Later, as we stood near the edge of the room, my ex returned. This time, his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't realize you were seeing someone," he said. "I'm not," I replied. The truth landed heavier than a lie would have. His brows furrowed. "Then, we came together," I said simply. I felt him glance sideways again, measuring, recalculating. "Oh," he said. "I see." But he didn't. Not really. What he saw was what everyone else saw. Status. Presence. A version of me that no longer needed explanation. And that unsettled him. As the evening continued, the distance between us widened naturally. Not through conflict, but through irrelevance. His world no longer felt central. No longer felt like something I needed to orbit. One point, I caught my reflection in a mirrored wall. I looked the same. Same dress. Same face. Same posture. But my eyes were different. Less guarded. More grounded. I realized then that I wasn't enjoying this. Not in the way I'd imagined. There was no thrill in being treated better. No satisfaction in watching people adjust their behavior. Just a quiet sadness. Because it confirmed what I had always suspected. That acceptance had been conditional. And that love, in that world, had never been the point. We stepped away from the crowd toward a quieter corridor, the noise fading behind us like a memory losing its grip. "You're very quiet," he said. "I'm processing," I replied. "What are you realizing?" he asked. "That I stayed in a place that required translation," I said. "And called it compromise." He stopped walking. I turned to face him. Up close, away from the room, his expression had softened. Not with pity. With something steadier. "They don't deserve access to you," he said. The words were simple. Undramatic. They hit anyway. "I don't want to be seen because of you," I said quickly, the fear surfacing. "I don't want this to be another version of borrowing worth." He studied me for a long moment. "That's not what's happening," he said. "You were always visible. They just chose not to look." I exhaled slowly. We stood there in silence, the party continuing without us, the world recalibrating behind closed doors. Then he spoke again. His voice was lower now. More deliberate. "There's something I need to ask you," he said. I looked at him. My chest tightened. I didn't know why, only that the weight of the evening had shifted again, coalescing into something new. Something I hadn't prepared for. That's when he asked me something I wasn't prepared for. We stepped into a quiet antechamber off the main hall, a space clearly designed for people who needed to pause without being seen pausing. The noise of the party dulled immediately, laughter flattening into a distant hum. The air here was cooler. Still. Almost reverent. For the first time that evening, I felt the weight leave my shoulders. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding myself together until the room released me. He closed the door gently behind us, not sealing us in, just marking the shift. Then he turned, leaning back against the wall, hands loosely folded, giving me space without stepping away. "You don't look surprised," I said quietly. "I'm not," he replied. I studied his face, searching for whatever had prompted the question he'd hinted at earlier. There was no triumph there. No satisfaction in the way the evening had unfolded. If anything, he looked reflective. "You saw it, didn't you?" I asked. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "How quickly it changed," I continued. "How differently they treated me." "Yes. And how easy it was," I added, my voice tightening despite my efforts to keep it steady. "How little it took." He nodded once, slow and deliberate. "I saw more than that," he said. I waited. "I saw how practiced you were at not reacting," he continued. "How you anticipated dismissal before it arrived. How you adjusted yourself to rooms like this long before anyone asked you to." The words landed softly, but they went deep. I looked away, my gaze catching on the soft glow of a wall sconce. "You didn't know me then," I said. "You can't know how it felt." "I know enough," he replied. "Because I've been on the other side of that glass." I turned back to him. This was the first time he'd spoken about himself without being prompted. "When I was younger," he said, "I learned early what it meant to be tolerated instead of welcomed." I didn't interrupt. "My family's world was insular," he continued. "We were invited into rooms because of what we represented, not who we were. And even then, we were reminded we were guests." I watched him closely now, the calm he wore so easily cracking just enough to let truth through. "There were expectations," he said. "Unspoken rules. I was expected to adapt, to smooth my edges, to be grateful for access." "That sounds familiar," I said quietly. He met my gaze. "I agreed to things I shouldn't have," he admitted. "Stayed where I was evaluated instead of valued. I told myself it was strategy. Patience." He paused, then added, "It was fear." The word hung between us, unadorned. "So when you approached me," he said, "I recognized it immediately." "What?" I asked. "Not desperation," he replied. "Resolve. The moment someone decides they won't disappear quietly." I felt my throat tighten. "I didn't agree because you needed a shield," he continued. "I agreed because you were standing at the same crossroads I once stood at." I absorbed that slowly. "You didn't rescue me," I said. "No," he replied. "I stood where you asked me to stand." The distinction mattered more than I could explain. "And the truth you asked for?" I said. "What was it you needed to hear?" "That you weren't trying to borrow worth," he said. "That you weren't asking me to overwrite your story." "And did I pass?" I asked, attempting a smile that didn't quite form. He stepped closer, not invading my space, just narrowing the distance enough to ground the moment. "You never needed permission," he said. "You just needed confirmation." The words unraveled something inside me I hadn't known was still knotted. "I spent so long trying to be acceptable," I said. "Trying to be easy to explain. I thought if I could just fit better, they'd stay." He listened the way he always did. Fully. Without interruption. "They stayed where they were comfortable," he said. "That had nothing to do with you." The simplicity of it hurt. And healed. I leaned back against the wall, mirroring his posture, the symmetry not lost on me. For the first time that evening, I let myself feel the exhaustion beneath the adrenaline. "I didn't enjoy tonight," I admitted. "Not the way I thought I would." He nodded. "Because validation feels hollow when it arrives late." "Yes," I said. "And because it made everything too clear." Silence settled again. Not awkward, not heavy. Just present. I realized then that the evening had already done its work. The room outside no longer held power over me. The people inside it had shrunk back into their proper proportions. "What happens now?" I asked softly. "That depends," he said. "On what?" I pressed. "On what you want this to be," he replied. "Not tonight. Beyond it." I studied him, searching for expectation, for pressure. There was none. Only curiosity. And respect. "I don't want to trade one hierarchy for another," I said. "I don't want to feel like my value is tied to proximity again." "It won't be," he said. "Not with me." "How can you be sure?" I asked. "Because I'm not offering you a place," he said. "I'm acknowledging the one you already occupy." The difference was subtle. It was everything. I felt the tension I'd carried for months finally begin to ease, replaced by something quieter and more durable. Clarity. I straightened, meeting his gaze fully now. Then ask me, I said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. Ask you what, he said. The question I hadn't been prepared for earlier resurfaced, clearer now, steadier. He took a breath, the first time I'd seen him hesitate all evening. Do you want this to end after tonight? The night didn't end with a declaration. There was no dramatic exit. No raised voices. No moment that demanded an audience. When we returned to the party, it was already winding down, conversations loosening into smaller clusters, the room exhaling after holding itself together for hours. I noticed how little it pulled at me now. How the weight I'd carried into it no longer belonged to me. We stayed just long enough to leave on our own terms. Outside, the air felt different. Cooler. Cleaner. Like a boundary had been crossed without ceremony. We stood on the steps for a moment, the city humming around us, the night unbothered by the quiet shift taking place inside me. I'll call you, he said. Not as a promise. As a statement. I nodded. I'd like that. And that was it. No rush. No pressure to define what we hadn't yet lived. Time did what it always does when it's finally allowed to work. Days passed. Then weeks. The birthday receded into memory, its sharp edges dulling until it became just another date that no longer carried authority. I stopped replaying conversations in my head. Stopped wondering how I'd been perceived. Stopped measuring my presence against rooms that had already lost relevance. We met again, quietly. Coffee, this time chosen without symbolism. Walks that didn't lead anywhere in particular. Conversations that didn't circle around the past unless invited. He didn't ask me to explain myself. That was new. We talked about work. About cities we'd lived in briefly and left without regret. About habits we'd kept longer than they deserved. When silence appeared, it wasn't something to fill. It rested comfortably between us, like proof that nothing was being performed. I noticed the change in myself first in small ways. I stopped checking my phone so often. Stopped second-guessing my responses. Stopped bracing for disappointment in moments that hadn't earned it. The hunger for validation faded gradually, like a sound lowering until you realize it's gone. One evening, weeks later, I passed the venue where the birthday had been held. The building looked smaller than I remembered. Less imposing. Just another structure made of glass and certainty. I didn't slow down. The past no longer reached for me the way it used to. Occasionally, I heard about my ex through mutual acquaintances. Updates delivered without intention. Promotions. New plans. A life continuing exactly as it had been designed to. It didn't sting. That surprised me the most. Not because I was indifferent, but because the story had finally returned to its rightful scale. He was no longer a measure of anything. Just a chapter that had ended when it needed to. What stayed with me instead were moments that felt grounded. The way he listened without waiting to speak. The way he stood beside me without assuming ownership. The way my voice sounded steadier when I spoke about myself, even when no one was evaluating. There was no rush to name what we were becoming. We didn't need to. What mattered was how it felt. Safe without being stagnant. Open without being exposed. One afternoon, sitting across from him in the same cafe where we'd first aligned realities, I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't trying to be chosen anymore. I was choosing. The realization settled gently, without fanfare. I used to think confidence arrived after acceptance, I said, stirring my coffee absently. He looked up. And now? Now I think acceptance arrives after confidence, I replied. He smiled. Not broadly. Not triumphantly. Just enough to acknowledge the truth. There were still moments of doubt. Growth doesn't erase habit overnight. But they passed more quickly now. They no longer took root. Because the foundation had shifted. I didn't need to be seen through someone else to exist fully. I had always been here. The night of the birthday had simply revealed it. Months later, when I thought back to the moment I'd stood in that hotel lounge, rehearsing a sentence I didn't believe would hold me, it felt distant. Not because it hadn't mattered, but because it had done its work. That woman wasn't weak. She was brave before she knew what bravery felt like. She had stepped forward without certainty, carrying nothing but the quiet refusal to disappear. And that was enough. I didn't gain a new identity from that night. I reclaimed an old one. One that didn't shrink. One that didn't negotiate its worth. One that understood that presence is power when it's chosen, not begged for. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Ari Love Beyond, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your presence here matters. Sometimes the moment meant to remind you of your place becomes the moment you leave it forever. Weeks passed after the birthday, and life settled into something quieter. Not healed, just steadier. The kind of steady that comes from learning how to breathe around a bruise without touching it. I went back to work. Back to early mornings and careful emails. Back to conversations that stayed on the surface. I stopped replaying that night as often. When it did return, it came without sharp edges. More like a memory you hold at arm's length. Still warm. Still unresolved. That was when the opportunity arrived. It came disguised as a routine message. A short email from a senior manager I'd worked with before. Polite. Efficient. The kind of tone that makes everything sound bigger than it is. A new contract. A potential collaboration. A meeting scheduled downtown. I read it twice, then once more for caution. Nothing in it suggested anything unusual. No names I recognized. No hints. Just a time, a location, and a line at the end that said they were looking forward to finally meeting me in person. Finally. That word stayed with me longer than it should have. The building was glass and steel, rising cleanly from the street like it had nothing to prove. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of citrus and polish. Everything echoed in a restrained way. Shoes on stone. Low voices. The hum of controlled movement. I signed in. Took the elevator up. Watched the numbers change without really seeing them. I told myself this was just another meeting. The conference room was already half full when I stepped in. Muted colors. Long table. Screens asleep on the wall. People arranging papers, checking phones, nodding to one another with practiced familiarity. No one looked up all at once. No one stopped talking. And then I felt it. Not a thought. Not a memory. A shift. The kind you feel before you understand why. I looked up. He was already there. Seated near the far end of the table. Dark suit. Open posture. Hands folded loosely, as if he'd been waiting for the room to catch up to him. He wasn't looking at me yet. He was listening to someone else speak, his head slightly inclined, attention precise and contained. For a moment, I didn't move. The world narrowed to details. The clean line of his jaw. The calm set of his shoulders. The way he occupied the space without drawing attention to himself. This wasn't the man from that night. This was someone else entirely. He looked up. Our eyes met. No surprise crossed his face. No recognition I could read. Just a measured pause, as if registering a fact and filing it away. Then he nodded. Once. Polite. Neutral. Professional. That was it. No smile. No warmth. No acknowledgement of what had passed between us. The room filled again with sound, and I realized I'd stopped breathing. I took the nearest seat and focused on the folder in front of me, though I didn't remember opening it. My hands felt steadier than they should have. My pulse less so. Was that night real? I asked myself that question more than once as the meeting began. Introductions moved around the table. Titles. Departments. Familiar words stacked in predictable patterns. When it reached him, he spoke briefly. No embellishment. No explanation. Just his name and role, delivered with an ease that suggested authority without needing to declare it. I didn't look at him while he spoke. I was afraid that if I did, something might give. As the discussion unfolded, I noticed things I hadn't before. How people angled their bodies slightly toward him when they spoke. How the room seemed to wait a half-second longer for his responses. How decisions paused until he weighed in, even when he said very little. He didn't interrupt. He didn't dominate. He simply observed. And when he did speak, the room adjusted. I found myself shrinking in ways I hadn't expected. Not from fear. From dissonance. From the collision of two versions of the same person that refused to align. The man who had listened to me in silence weeks ago. The man who now sat across from me, composed and distant. I couldn't tell which one was real, or if both were. The meeting progressed into specifics. Budgets, timelines, deliverables. I contributed when appropriate, my voice steady, my points clear. No one questioned my competence. No one dismissed me. Still, I felt exposed. Every time I spoke, I was aware of him listening. Not watching. Listening. It was worse. There was no private acknowledgement when the meeting ended. No lingering glance. No unspoken question. He gathered his notes, exchanged a few quiet words with someone beside him, and stood. People followed his lead without realizing they were doing it. As he passed behind my chair, I caught the faintest trace of his presence. Familiar. Unavoidable. He didn't stop. I stayed seated until the room began to empty, then slowly packed my things. My reflection in the dark screen looked composed. I didn't feel composed. In the hallway outside, 2 colleagues spoke in low voices ahead of me. I wasn't trying to listen. The words reached me anyway. Looks like it's approved, one said. Already, the other replied. That was fast. Of course. Once it goes through him, things move. I slowed. Lucky timing, the first added. Not many get that kind of green light on the first round. They disappeared around the corner, still talking. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, my thoughts rearranging themselves carefully. Approved. I hadn't been told yet. No email. No confirmation. Just a fragment of conversation, floating loose. I replayed the meeting in my head. The moments when discussions paused. The way he'd nodded once, almost imperceptibly, when my proposal was mentioned. Power, exercised quietly, leaves fewer fingerprints. I left the building with a strange calm settling over me. Not relief. Not excitement. Recognition. Something was moving beneath the surface, and I wasn't part of the conversation yet. On the walk back to my car, I thought of the night we'd stood side by side, pretending. How safe that had felt. How honest in its own way. Today, there had been no pretense at all. Just distance. Just control. And the unsettling sense that something I was waiting for had already been decided. Optional soft pause, reflective tone. If you've ever wondered how people cross your life again when you least expect it, you're not alone. Stories like this live here. Ari Love Beyond. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a notification. A calendar invite. No message. No explanation. Just a time. A place. And his name listed among the attendees. I stared at it longer than I needed to. The decision I'd been waiting on had already been approved. By him. I just didn't know it yet. He asked after the meeting. Not immediately. Not in front of anyone. Not in a way that turned heads. The room had emptied, chairs pushed back into place, screens dimmed again. I was gathering my things slowly, pretending to review notes I already knew by heart. He waited until the last voice faded down the hallway before speaking. Would you have dinner with me? No flourish. No explanation. His tone was steady, unassuming, as if he were asking a question that had only one job. To be honest. I looked up at him, and for a second my body answered before my mind did. A tightening in my chest. A reflexive no forming at the back of my throat. Old instincts reaching for safety. I almost said it. Almost. He must have seen the hesitation because he added, calmly, there's no expectation. If you'd rather not, that's fine. That was the part that disarmed me. No pressure. No implication that this was an extension of anything else. No reference to the night that hovered between us like a shared dream neither of us had acknowledged. Just an invitation. I need to check my schedule, I said, defaulting to professionalism. It sounded thin, even to me. He nodded. Of course. Then, as if to prove his point, he turned back to his notes. The moment was already being released. I found myself stopping him anyway. When? He glanced at me, not triumphant. Not hopeful. Just attentive. Tomorrow, he said. If that works. It didn't. And yet, tomorrow is fine, I heard myself say. We didn't go anywhere impressive. That was the first surprise. No panoramic views. No private rooms. No hush staff who knew his name. He suggested a place a few streets away from the office. A small restaurant tucked between a bookstore and a closed florist, its windows fogged slightly from the inside. Inside, the tables were close together. The lighting was warm but uneven. There was a chalkboard menu with handwriting that looked like it changed daily. I noticed the absence of spectacle immediately. And so did my nerves. Without the structure of a meeting or the armor of distance, I felt exposed in a new way. This wasn't a continuation of business. This wasn't a performance. This was intentional. We sat across from each other, menus open but unread. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Not out of awkwardness. Out of adjustment. "This place," he said finally, "doesn't try to impress." I smiled before I could stop myself. "Neither of us does," I replied, then wondered why I'd said it. He considered that. "You're wrong," he said gently. "You just don't do it loudly." The server came by, breaking the moment. We ordered simply. When the menus were taken away, the table felt smaller. More intimate. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted. "I wasn't sure either," I said honestly. Another pause. This one heavier. He leaned back slightly, giving the space room to breathe. "I wanted to explain something," he said. "If you'll let me." I nodded. "I stayed away," he began, choosing each word carefully, because I didn't want to confuse kindness with claim. I frowned slightly. "I don't understand." He met my eyes. That night mattered. But it didn't give me ownership over what came next. You needed to decide what it meant without my influence. There it was. The answer I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for. "You could have reached out," I said quietly. "Yes," he agreed. "And it would have been easier. For me. Not for you," he didn't say. He didn't have to. The food arrived, steam rising between us. For a moment, we focused on eating, the normalcy grounding. Forks clinking softly. The murmur of other conversations filling the gaps. I remembered things, he said after a while. Small things. Like what? I asked, unsure if I wanted to know. He didn't answer right away. He watched me instead, as if confirming something. "The way you pause before you speak," he said finally. "Not because you're unsure. Because you're considering how your words will land." I felt heat rise to my face. "The way you listen," he continued. "Not waiting for your turn. Actually listening." I looked down at my plate. "And the silence," he added. "You're comfortable with it. Most people aren't." I swallowed. "Those aren't reasons to ask someone out." "No," he agreed. "They're reasons to miss someone." That word landed softly but firmly. Miss. Not need. Not want. I set my fork down. "You don't know me," I said, more defensively than I meant to. "I know," he replied. "But I know enough to be careful." That was the moment I felt the imbalance again. Not of power. Of certainty. "You live in a world that bends around you," I said, surprising myself with the sharpness in my voice. "People adjust. I don't want to disappear inside that." He didn't argue. "That's fair," he said. No reassurance. No promises that I wouldn't. No claims that love would solve it. Just acknowledgement. "I don't want you to," he added after a moment. "Which is why I asked you this way. And why I'll accept whatever answer you give." The rest of dinner unfolded quietly. We talked about ordinary things. Work challenges. Books we'd abandoned halfway through. Places we'd lived briefly and never quite left behind. There was laughter, but it was restrained. Not the kind that fills a room. The kind that settles into it. When we stepped outside, the night air was cool, the street lamps casting uneven shadows. We stood there for a moment, neither of us reaching for the next step. "I need time," I said finally. Not as a defense. As a truth. "I know," he replied. "Our history," I continued, "started in a strange place. And your life, it has gravity. I don't want to orbit it." He listened. Really listened. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'll still be here." No persuasion. No chase. No attempt to rewrite my fear. He didn't touch me. He didn't lean in. He simply stepped back, giving me space to choose what came next. As I walked away, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not certainty, but peace. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something I had to outrun or surrender to. It felt open. And that was enough. I didn't find out the way stories usually tell it. There was no dramatic confession. No private office. No heavy pause before a truth revealed like a weapon. I found out because of structure. The company event was meant to be forgettable. A quarterly gathering in a neutral venue. Clean branding. Soft music. Conversations designed to sound spontaneous, while circling the same safe topics. I almost didn't go. Not because of him. Because things had felt settled. Not defined. Not resolved. But no longer fragile. We'd kept our distance since the dinner. Friendly emails. Professional exchanges. Nothing that leaned too far forward. I arrived late. Slipped in quietly. Took a glass of water instead of wine. That's when I noticed it again. The pause. A senior executive mid-sentence, stopping just a beat too long before continuing. A subtle shift in posture from people who were used to holding rooms. The way conversations bent, not toward noise, but toward silence. Toward him. He stood near the edge of the space, speaking with someone older, both of them relaxed in a way that didn't ask for permission. When another person joined them, they waited. When he spoke, they listened. No announcement was made. No spotlight turned. But the pattern was unmistakable. I watched as a decision was deferred without question. As someone asked for confirmation they didn't technically need. As a phrase was repeated twice, quietly, with a kind of respect that carried weight. Once it's cleared upstairs. Upstairs. I felt the pieces slide into place without resistance. The approval that came too easily. The meeting that shifted because he nodded once. The way doors opened before I knew I was standing in front of them. It wasn't secrecy. It was restraint. Someone near me laughed softly and said, "Well, if he's comfortable with it, we're all good." I didn't ask who they meant. I already knew. The realization didn't sting the way I expected. It didn't feel like betrayal. It felt explanatory. Like a sentence finally ending in punctuation. I left early. Not because I was overwhelmed. Because I wanted to think before reacting. To meet the truth with the same calm it had been offered. I texted him once I was home. "Can we talk?" The reply came quickly. "Of course." We met the next day, somewhere neutral again. A quiet park bench beneath trees that had just started shedding leaves. No audience. No formality. I didn't sit too close. "I know," I said. He didn't pretend not to understand. He exhaled slowly. "I assumed you would. Eventually. You own the company," I said. Not accusatory. Just factual. "Yes." No justification followed. No apology rushed in to soften the word. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. He considered the question carefully. "Because I didn't want it to be the reason you stayed." That wasn't my question. He met my gaze. "I didn't want it to be the reason you chose." The answer was too clean to argue with. "I needed to know," he continued, "that if you walked away, it would be because you decided to, not because the ground shifted under your feet." I absorbed that in silence. "You didn't hide it," I said slowly. "You just didn't lead with it." "Yes." "And the approvals?" "The access." "I never intervened without being asked," he said. "And I never asked anyone to treat you differently." I thought of the birthday. The way attention had rearranged itself around him. The way power announces itself without speaking. "You still change the room," I said. "I change rooms whether I want to or not," he replied. "What I can control is whether I use that to pull someone closer." That landed. This wasn't about deception. It was about choice. About letting truth arrive when it could stand on its own. "I needed to know you'd stand," he said. "Even if you walked away from me." I felt something settle inside my chest. Not relief. Recognition. I was afraid of disappearing, I admitted. Of becoming a footnote in someone else's life. "You didn't," he said gently. "You never did." We sat there for a while after that. Watching people pass. Letting the weight of the conversation dissipate naturally. There was no dramatic declaration. No kiss that sealed anything. Just an understanding, earned slowly, without pressure. I realized then that power hadn't erased my agency. It had tested it. And I had kept it. I didn't choose him that day. Not explicitly. But I didn't step away either. I chose to continue. To move forward without shrinking. To let connection exist without surrender. And that choice felt like mine in a way nothing else ever had. Final reflective pause, soft and sincere. If this story made you think about timing, choice, or the quiet ways love grows, subscribe to Ari Love Beyond, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Someone else might need this story too. I learned something important in the end. Not every love story begins with certainty. Some begin with respect. And this time, I didn't walk beside him to be seen. I walked beside him because I already was.